So, I don't know if you've ever ridden a bike in New York City, but it's a lot of fun. We did some videos recently, actually, just touring around the city, and it's a really good time. But there's one thing that kind of stinks about riding a bike in the city, and it's just that there's not really any place to put your bike. And I think this bike parking topic is really important, and that's really what I want to cover today. Talk about the different types of bike parking, maybe some places that have been successful with bike parking, what we might see in the future, and just a little bit more of my thoughts and my experience with that, because I think that this is a really important detail to the future of cycling, and certainly the future of cycling in cities and cycling for transportation. Now, sure, you can lock it up on the street, but in a place like New York, it can be a bit vulnerable. Some of you may or may not know bike theft is a really big thing in New York. I think it's probably one of the biggest limiting factors to people getting on bikes. Or if somebody does get their bike stolen, I'm not sure if they'll actually go back to biking. I actually had one bike stolen. I've been fortunate to only have one bike stolen in my life, and I was like around 11 years old when that happened. I know that was a pretty terrible experience. It was a cool bike. It was a GT Performer. I was very excited about this bike, and it got stolen along with my brother's bike, and I eventually got a bike again. I guess my family was in a well enough position to buy me another bike, but not everybody's always in that position. And even if you are in that position, it can feel pretty violating. So I think tackling this problem is probably one of the bigger things to consider in getting more people into biking, or just affording more people the opportunity to enjoy biking, and certainly enjoy biking as a form of transportation. If you're using a bike for recreation, you can plan your route and you don't necessarily need to worry about, locking your bike up along the way, or whereas when you're using a bike for transportation or running errands or that sort of thing, it ends up being that you have to lock up your bike more often. It's just otherwise you can't really go anywhere. What are you going to do? Maybe you can have a small folding bike and you could bring it inside with you, and that's certainly a consideration. But to have a place to put your bike is a lot nicer. Now, there's a lot of buildings now in the city and really all over that are starting to include bike parking. And actually, it's a new requirement in New York City and a lot of other cities that when there's a new building being built, it's actually required to have bike parking in the building, which I think that's pretty cool, and I'm excited about that, and it might give you some idea where things are going here. But what about when you're not at home or you're not in an apartment that has that sort of thing? Shouldn't the city maybe be able to provide these sort of spaces? I guess in a lot of ways when you think about it, like there's a lot of spaces provided for cars, but for bikes, not so much. So the bike parking that probably most people are familiar with, and the ones that you see in most places, is kind of a regular bike rack. Now these can generally accommodate one or two bikes with like a simple single sort of stand or system, if you will, but sometimes you'll see multiple of them in a row. Then you can have like what's called like a bike corral, and all of these are generally these like freestanding, no real shelter for the bike. It's not like necessarily protected from the elements or anything like that, and it's just you take that bike rack system and you add your bike and you add your own lock, and you are increasing the security level, because if you had just the bike and the lock alone, then somebody could potentially pick it up and walk away with it. Now, an interesting thing I should note is that, visiting other countries, that's sometimes how people do lock their bikes. Many bikes have this lock called a cafe lock or a frame lock, and basically they just lock the rear wheel of the bike, and that's generally sufficient to prevent somebody from walking off with that. The first time seeing this, I was a little bit surprised, especially coming from a place like New York City where that just doesn't cut it. There's many locks which are just not at all sufficient, because there's kind of like a professional industry of thieves, unfortunately, in a place like New York City, and I think many other cities. But something to be mindful of is that there could be a scenario where your bike lock is actually more secure than the bike rack that you're locking it to. So it's important to consider these details, when you're locking up your bike, because some of them are like bolted together, they seem kind of chintzy, and you definitely want to lock your bike to something secure, particularly when you're in a less secure place. I've had scenarios where my bike is within sight, I can see it, and I actually use like the strap from my helmet to lock it. It's just basically to prevent somebody from easily like running off with the bike. That was a sufficient enough security in that scenario. However, if I'm gonna go into the movie theater or into a restaurant or something like that and lock it for a more extended period, you certainly need more security. I think the standard bike rack kind of works if it's actually secure enough to the ground, and sometimes they're not secure. There's all sorts of weird things. They're not maintained properly or whatever. You have good locks, usually multiple locks. That's generally my suggestion. Maybe it's in an area that's not totally away from all people, giving thieves more time to really work on the lock, if you will. Overnight, that's certainly a scenario that gets a little bit iffy. But, thinking about what, beyond the standard bike rack, like what other options are there, something that we're starting to see is these more secure biking lockers or just different facilities. I've seen actually where I grew up on Long Island, they had these bike lockers, and it's just basically a space that's maybe about 8 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, somewhere in that area. And you actually put your bike into this individual locker. And these are generally at train stations. And I think they have some of these on the West Coast as well, and probably other places as well, I'm sure. This seems to be a good solution because really, I think that's one of the big things, right? Like if you're thinking about a bike as transportation, as I was talking about before, if you want to leave the bike somewhere for an extended period, it really makes it particularly vulnerable, especially if it's a nicer bike. A thief could see the bike. Maybe it's the sort of thing that this bike is going to be at the same place consistently over and over again. And a thief has the opportunity to plan how to steal it. And, that's not really ideal. But, if your bike maybe has a cover on it, or if it's inside of one of these lockers, that could help, certainly. Nothing really can totally prevent all theft, but there's certainly a lot of measures that can be taken to significantly reduce the chances of your bike being stolen. One of the things that we're seeing that's coming up more and more are these larger bike facilities, bike parking facilities. I've seen a variety of different systems out there. Now, we visited Copenhagen not too long ago, there's actually a parking garage, and inside of the parking garage, there's a specific facility for parking bikes, and you have an attendant there all the time as well. And I think that really significantly reduces the chances of theft. Then there's some of these ones that don't require any attendant, and you generally sign up for it. You get a fob or something like that, or maybe you get a code. That increases the security because only the person with that code is entering. They usually have cameras. There's a lot of different measures that are included here to increase the security here. And I kind of feel like this is where we need to go. I know that there's other discussions about GPS tracking and alarms and all that sort of stuff, and it's not going to solve all the problems. We've spoken about this before. You have a GPS tracker, if bike gets stolen, who knows, by the time you find the bike, it might be stripped down. There's a good chance that the police are not actually going to help you secure the bike if you were to even locate where it was. It's probably not a good idea on a personal level to actually go and pursue that bike, even with the GPS tracking. A lot of cities are really just not taking this that seriously. They kind of think of bikes as a secondary thing. It's just a recreation thing. Do we really have to worry about bike parking? But, many cities want to encourage biking, but they're actually not supporting the infrastructure that's required to do that. Obviously, I think it's important I'm making this video, but I think that more people should be thinking about it, and I want to kind of introduce this topic and maybe spark some more discussion on that. If you have your own experience with bike parking, maybe you can leave a comment and we can talk more about it, because this really, from my perspective, is one of the main reasons why people don't bike in cities. I know in talking with a lot of people that had interacted with in New York City, I would ask them oh, do you bike? And many people would say, well, when I first moved here, I got a bike, then it got stolen, and I decided I'm not going to bike anymore. What a terrible story, they kind of had this experience. I'm sure many people, including myself, really enjoy biking in a city like New York, but then they don't have these facilities to actually enjoy it properly. It's unfortunate. I know that there's a lot of arguments. Again, I don't want to get too controversial here, but there's a lot of arguments that there's a lot of these facilities provided for cars, but they're not provided for bikes. And maybe it's because, historically bikes haven't really been a very big mode of transportation in these different places, or maybe at least across the whole spectrum of people in the city. Historically, really, in a lot of places, including where I grew up, biking for transportation was generally for people maybe they didn't have so much means, and often those people were not represented that well in government, and that's a really unfortunate reality. And I mean, another reality is that as other people start to use these things, maybe a lot of times people might have a little bit more influence with the right people to help push some of these things forward, or at least know how to do that. I know different people might have some different opinions on that, but I think it's an important consideration. And that's one of the cool things that I found about New York City is that all different people ride bikes. And actually, that's the same case with a lot of more evolved cities. Many cities in the Netherlands, this is the case. And actually, I was reading something not too long ago. There's actually a culture around this, and it's an important detail for many of the people that live in these cities. And I know a lot of people that watch my videos happen to be from the Netherlands, so I've been fortunate to interact with many of them. And I was really impressed and appreciated this culture which exists in the Netherlands of riding a bike, and not even necessarily just riding a bike, but kind of riding like a rundown bike a little bit, to show that even if you have established some sort of higher class in your life, or you made more money, or whatever the case may be, but you still are human just like everybody else. You still are on the same level playing field. And I think that's kind of interesting. I think that there's something to that. I think there's something special to cities that can kind of look at things in that way. I think maybe in some ways it's just like everybody riding the subway in New York City. You have the full cross section of people riding the subway. It's not just people that can't afford a car, as maybe it might be in a place like LA, which seems to be more the norm. I mean, some people might argue that this is a different scenario, but from my experience, at least from the peripheral, I've only lived in the LA area for a couple of years, but it seems like that's the case. And I think that's really unfortunate. This is what my experience is, visiting many of these different cities that have really good infrastructure, really good public transportation. And I think it changed the city for the better. Some people might argue that it doesn't. Some people will say, well, I want to keep separate. I don't want somebody to have access to be able to take the train into my city, or whatever the case may be, which is a big fight that sometimes happens in LA. And maybe that happens other places, and maybe I'm not so aware of it. I'm sure it does, bike parking. We should talk about that. We talked about these like secure facilities. I kind of think that this is the future, these like secure parking facilities. Now, I happen to have met the founder or the creator of one of these. It's a company called Uni. The gentleman's name is Shabazz Stewart, and he lives in Brooklyn. He grew up in Brooklyn. He was actually involved in a BID, like the Business Improvement District. He noticed that there's this need, and he actually created this company based on this need. And so he created this company called Uni, and it's a secure bike parking facility. Or not just bikes, I guess you can park electric bikes, you can park scooters. I think there's actually some charging facilities inside there for electric bikes. And it uses a fob, so you sign up and you can use this fob and access that, and it's super cool. One of the things people might often wonder about these is like, how do you actually get one of these things into your city, into your area, or whatever? Who pays for it? How does that all work? And I think that's one of the challenges with this infrastructure, and I think that it kind of requires some more education, and that's what I'm hoping that these sort of videos can help with, to get people thinking differently about this stuff. But those Uni things, I mean, they can be implemented in a variety of different ways. I guess one, a city or a municipality could potentially, sponsor one and just say, hey, we want this to be here. The probably smarter and more economical choice is to partner with an advertiser or a sponsor, and that's something that we're seeing with a lot of these sort of programs. Probably one of the biggest that we know of in the U.S. is like City Bike, for example. In New York City, the bike share program is sponsored by Citibank. Right? So they put their name on there and they help subsidize this program. In some places, cities take it on their own, but I think oftentimes they struggle to do that because it costs a lot of money, and really these things, I feel like they're helpful to be like public services, and it helps to have some of those different sponsors to bring the cost down, make it accessible to everybody, because I think these things really only work if they're accessible to everybody. In Taiwan, I saw some different versions they have. Actually went to a Taiwan bike show, which they showed all different varieties. Some are like these outside, like carousel sort of things. I've seen in Japan, they have these underground parking setups, which are really cool. You like put your bike in, it like drops it down underground. And this is what leading cities are doing. This is the future, I believe. I mean, a lot of cities, as I said, really want to encourage cycling. This is important to do. LA is actually, as much as they have their struggles with actually promoting safe cycling and really providing the adequate resources for cyclists to enjoy cycling and to do it safely, they're actually doing some good things here. They have several of these hub stations, they call them, I think, like that. I think they have like 5 or so right now, but they put out an RFP, a request for proposal, not too long ago to add several of them as a pilot program in the hopes to add upwards of like 100 of them over the next several years. Now, I don't know with COVID how that might like kind of thrown a wrench in that plan, but I really applaud them for making these efforts because I think it's really important. Aside from just having bike lanes and safe infrastructure, having a secure place to put your bike is super important. I think I said that a couple times already, but I think about all the people that are like limited in their ability to use a bike and to use it for certain functions because they don't have secure bike parking. Now, some people might just think like, oh, this is just a luxury or this is just for people with nice bikes, but the reality is like if you don't have a place to put your bike, like you can't use it. And so a lot of times people are forced to use other forms of transportation because they don't have this sort of thing available. And it might not be as big of an issue in more suburban areas, like maybe you have a garage and you're maybe not locking it, at places so often or whatever the case may be, or maybe, if theft is not an issue. But the reality is like where I live in the U.S., it's an issue. Most cities or larger cities that I'm aware of, it's a big issue. So having these amenities are really important. This particular video, in a lot of ways, was sparked by some discussions that were going on by Transportation Alternatives, a alternative transportation advocacy group in New York City. And they did a study about bike parking, and they studied, New York City, which biking is ever increasing pretty dramatically. And they looked at how many bike parking facilities are available, how many just bike stands or bike corrals, which is like multiple stands generally in a street, because many times there's places where there's just a lot of people parking their bikes. Like, for example, one of the big ones is like a transit hub. So you have like a subway or potentially a bus station or something like that, and people want to park their bike and go for extended periods somewhere. So a lot of times you have a large amount of bikes parking in these areas. Those are the places I think where actually having secure bike parking is most important, because if somebody's taking their bike, getting on a train, potentially going somewhere for a day or potentially more than a day, that to a thief is probably a very attractive place. And so having something with a little bit more security than you might have just outside of a cafe, it's an important consideration. So I think they're thinking more about this. I remember actually a couple years ago, the city had put out an RFP that they wanted to put in the shipping container, bike parking things, and the economics didn't really make too much sense. Basically, the RFP, the way they put it out was that they wanted somebody to operate these things, and you had to figure out a way to make money with them, but not charge people so much for parking their bike there. So like it can only cost a very minimal amount, like you pay like $40 a month or something like that. So you have to find other ways, like I guess you can offer like repair services or this and that, and maybe there's a way to do it, but we tried to run the numbers and see if it was at all interesting. And as much as I love the idea, I didn't think it made too much sense. My feeling is the best way to make this happen is with a corporate sponsor. This is actually the same way that bus stations came into New York City. So actually all the bus stations you see, and generally you see like on the side Clear Channel, a lot of times these advertising companies actually own the bus station, or they paid to actually put the bus station in. And I don't know the whole story. Maybe somebody can correct me in the comments, but to my understanding, someone years ago, probably 20, 30 plus years ago, came to the city and said, hey, we want to put in these bus shelters, and they're going to cost whatever, a couple $1,000s to put in. We'll put them in for free. We just want the advertising on the side of the station. There you go. You got free bus stations. And I'm sure people have different opinions. I don't know. I don't know what the other perspective is on this. I'm sure the person that is getting saved from the rain appreciates the fact that thing exists, and they don't mind that somebody's advertising on the side of it. But maybe some other people feel differently about that. I really appreciate you guys listening. As you can see, I'm kind of excited about this topic. I want to talk some more in the future. I plan to create more videos on these sort of topics about how we can maybe encourage change and consider some other details that are actually limiting cycling, because some people might say like, oh, people don't bike because bikes are too expensive, or because you get cold, or whatever the case may be. But from my perspective, this is one of the big ones, and I don't think it's talked about enough. If you want to see more of these, let us know in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Well, see you soon. You have a peace sign this time. I don't even know what happened there.